Welcome to the No Shame Podcast. This is where we explore critical stories that take place right at the intersection of faith and culture. I'm John Grooters. Today we're going to meet Michele Rigby Assad. She's a woman, she's a Christian, and she's a former undercover CIA spy who was stationed in the heart of the Middle East and in the heart of the violence.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame.
Well, this is John Grooters with the No Shame Podcast, and our guest today is Michele Rigby Assad. Now, is it Assad, or how do you say your last name?
That's correct. You got it, Assad.
Because it says in your book that the pronunciation of the last name Assad is a dead giveaway in the Middle East. Can you tell me about that?
Sure, yeah. So actually there are two different forms of Assad, and they're spelled differently in Arabic. So one is Assad, which is like the president in Syria, and the other is Assad, which means happier versus lion. And Assad, lion, tends to refer to Muslims, and Assad, it tends to refer to Christians. And so when somebody asks you that question in the Middle East, they're generally trying to figure out what your religion is.
Well, no, see, I already knew all that, but I wanted our listeners to be brought up to speed on that. So thank you for joining us. Now, Michele is... For all of you, she has written a new book. You may have heard of this book called Breaking Cover. And Michele, you're one of the more interesting people that I've had the chance to talk to on the No Shame Podcast because you're the first counterterrorism CIA. And I guess I want to start this interview by just saying thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for saying that. I appreciate it.
There are so many people that we never meet or read about or anything who give their lives to make the world a safer place. And we take it for granted. What can we say? But you guys, you and your husband, Joseph, have risked and traveled. And why did you do it?
You know, I think for my husband, it was a really easy choice, having grown up in Egypt as a persecuted Christian. When he came to the United States and eventually became American, he was just so proud of being able to say he was American, and he understood what freedom was on a level that most of us just can't relate to. And so then to be able to use his native level Arabic to serve the U.S. government and as a counterterrorism officer was just a dream come true. And for me, after learning about, what it's like in the Middle East, the canaries in the coal mine, the Christians who've been persecuted for a very long time, we understood what the terrorism risk was just from that alone. And so then to be able to, again, serve our country abroad was just very meaningful for us.
What is, from your firsthand perspective, what is the climate of Christianity? I know it's different in different places, but from your observation in the Middle East today, what's the climate of Christianity?
Well, it certainly has changed quite a bit. It's ever since Islam came into the Middle East in the 7th century, came out of the Arabian Peninsula, it's been really hard to be anything but a Muslim after Islam became the majority religion. And so to live under Sharia law where you don't have a Bill of Rights, you don't have what we call a democracy where everyone is equal, you essentially have a system that says, okay, you're only equal if you're Muslim. If you're non-Muslim, you don't have these rights. And so there's nowhere to turn when something goes wrong. And it's a really hard way to live. And so the climate for Christians is they're kind of used to living not even as second-class citizens, but just as someone who should have converted and never converted and are treated as such in most of the places they live. And it's a hard, they're quite used to it because it's been centuries of that. But at the same time, so many of them have experienced repeat persecution, being chased from their ancient villages multiple times by Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whomever. And so they really understand what it's like to really have to rely on God and not having much else.
Anything that I ask you, I apologize in advance for for acting at times like there's a neat answer or there's a quick bow, because it's not that way. But you talk about since the 7th century, and I want to ask you about this verse that's near the end of your book, where you remind us of God's power is made perfect in weakness. You know, the weakness of the Christian community in the Muslim majority is stunning. How have you seen or perceived that in weakness God's power shows that He will, confound the wise and work through the weak?
Yeah, I mean, when things are easy, it's easy to rely on ourselves. I mean, when you don't need anything and everything is fine and simple, you tend to just rest on your own laurels. But when you really are in a struggle for existence or in a struggle for basics in life, you have to rely on something much bigger than yourself. And so I think the beauty about God is in those moments when we stop, when we allow that struggle to, instead of run from God or question Him, to embrace it, because He is, again, it's so obvious how amazing He is in those moments if we'll put our eyes on Him.
Well, you have been in a few circumstances, more than a few, where that had to become pretty real for you. Let's talk about your story a little bit. You ended up a CIA agent. Can you tell me how that happened and why you did that?
I never dreamed of that. I can tell you I did not grow up as a little kid thinking I'm going to be a spy.
Right. You just beat up people all the time, probably.
No, I actually wanted to be a ballerina or a Rockette on Broadway, but I was very passionate about foreign cultures, which I discovered through National Geographic magazine. And so that passion took me to mission trips. And multiple mission trips later, I ended up going to Georgetown to get a master's degree in Arab studies. And I got recruited basically out of into the CIA from Georgetown.
The CIA, probably most of us know everything we know about the CIA based on a TV show or a movie or maybe a news story. And I was really kind of chuckling in a way when I read your book, Michele, that you kind of let me down quickly. It wasn't a real warm welcome, it didn't seem, when you first got deployed. Can you sort of tell us about expectation versus reality?
Oh, yeah, my goodness. I didn't have the proper expectations either, for the very same reason you just mentioned. It's not like I know all these other spies and I know what to envision my life is going to be like. And so when my husband and I got sent abroad on our first tour after we completed training, we flew 36 hours to arrive at a location that felt like it was on just the edge of the earth. And it was a very, very dangerous place, a carjacking and kidnapping, one of the capitals of the world, and very tribal, very rugged, very mountainous. And then we were introduced to our boss, who didn't like us from the get-go and basically cursed at us and told us not to mess up our new jobs. And it's just a really kind of a surprise when you've sold your house and you sold your car and you said goodbye to your family and friends and you basically left it all behind to essentially serve your country. And so that was not the warmest welcome, certainly not the one I envisioned.
Yeah. I don't know how many people have read, many books from spies, but Breaking Cover by Michele Rigby Assad is a great one. And it strikes me, you spend a lot of time sort of explaining to us sort of the real life that we all live. Like you don't give us sort of this James Bond existence, but you talked about, you did make this sacrifice, you went through training, you get over there and your boss won't talk to you and doesn't like you and ignores you in the hallway. And how many people have bad bosses?
Tons of us.
Right.
They're all over the place. Yes.
What do you have to say to people who have bad bosses?
Yeah, because I lived with bad bosses, one after the other after the other. And so, life was not rainbows and unicorns in the CIA. But I think that my lesson to people is sometimes we go through struggles and really hard times and we're in situations that we cannot understand. Why do I have to go through this? Why am I in this job that I hate? Why is this thing happening to me? And it's only later in our life that we can realize, I had to be there in that particular place because God wanted me to learn A, B, and C, which he then used later in my life so I could serve others in this other position. So it's almost like every difficulty I look back on, which was so painful to experience, I could later on down the road see how God was using that to shape me and teach me other things. And so really it's just hang in there long enough that you can see how God can use these difficulties to shape you and use them for really awesome things.
Now, this might be not what you intended, but when you're being deployed into the Middle East, and by the way, Michele, I've been in many, many Middle East countries too, and spent a lot of time filming, never in the war effort, but throughout Oman and Kuwait and Bahrain and Egypt and Jordan and Israel and Turkey. So I've been there.
Oh wow!
And have just a deep I resonate with what you're talking about. How the food in some places is better, some places are beautiful, some places are tough. But I had this sense that you guys are ready to go to the Middle East, ready to face down the enemy and save the country and give your lives. And the first thing you have is just this irritating office job. Like it wasn't very heroic.
No, it took many years for it. So, what's fun about breaking cover is breaking down this image of what you think the CIA might be from the movies and replacing it with kind of a view of what life really is like day to day. And it's obviously not drinking martinis and driving fast cars. But what it turned out to be was so fascinating. Just the whole psychology of espionage, the whole opportunity to meet with people who are so different than you. So here you are debriefing terrorist sources to get the intelligence you need to stop terrorist attacks from occurring, interacting with people who, if they met you on the street, would prefer to slit your throat. But you're now dealing with them in this weird partnership. And so this whole interpersonal aspect of espionage and operations, I think, is the most compelling and interesting. And I've heard from my readers that they truly enjoy that special view into the CIA.
Well, you raise a really interesting topic multiple times in the book, and it's the topic of trust. I mean, there's all kinds of irony between being a spy who's in a way living a lie. At the same time, having to determine when you do these debriefings, when you're meeting, these people that you describe in your book, and you have to make a determination if they're telling you the truth. Right.
It's such a fascinating process. So yeah, you're hired because the CIA, says you are an honest person, but now we want you to live this huge lie by being undercover. But when you think about it, there are a lot of other jobs that are similar. One thing in the Christian world is missionaries.
Right. Missionaries, yeah.
Right. So missionaries, you can't necessarily tell everyone what you're doing, especially in, dicey places. You have to hide the fact that you are there for faith reasons. And so in that reason, it's very similar. But the idea of then having to deal with these sources and figure out whether they're lying to you is a very interesting and fun challenge.
You've you have a few great stories in the book. One of which maybe you could elaborate on. There was a man who claimed to be one of Saddam Hussein's, right-hand men, and
yes.
gave key intel. And can you just sort of, do you remember meeting that guy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is fascinating because I always thought it would be so difficult to find out if somebody's lying to you. And this is the day that I realized I had a facility for reading body language. And I was debriefing this guy who, basically said, I'm a real big bad guy. I'm a cell leader for Al-Qaeda. I used to be one of Saddam Hussein's henchmen. And so I was very excited to meet this guy and learn, what does somebody like that look like? What do they act like? What's it going to be like to interact with him? And I got in front of this man, and I was really disappointed because he was very kind of a twig of a guy. And when I started briefing him, something felt very wrong. And it took me several days to kind of figure the whole thing out. But then I realized his nonverbal behavior was telling me he was not an Al-Qaeda cell leader because he didn't have an ego, like a huge, enormous ego, like all of the other terrorists I had debriefed. And I realized it was his behavior and the way he was sitting and the way he was interacting with me. He just lacked that enormous ego that I'd come to recognize so clearly with the really bad guys. And so, and then when I asked him questions about what he did in the terrorist cell, he should have been able to rattle off to me, hours worth of what's it like to be an Al-Qaeda Amir, a cell leader. And he could barely, tell me a minute's worth of what he did for Al-Qaeda. And it let me in on, oh my goodness, this guy can't even hold up his own story. And it was so there were both verbal and nonverbal cues that I learned to look for to determine if somebody's lying to you or if they're telling you the truth.
Now, in this case, it's sort of like everyone exaggerates their own resume, right? This guy wanted to kind of stay important, and we've seen that, even those of us that haven't been in the CIA in Iraq.
Absolutely.
But you could also get too skeptical, right? Like you've had other situations where a guy calls you, says he noticed something fishy in a building, and you had to make a determination whether to recommend to the guys who were deployed whether that was a trap, Right. You can't just sort of always go one way or the other, right?
Absolutely, and then I think that's where there was so much stress because it was life or death situations. And so this other source, his story sounded really fishy. I mean, I saw some guy coming out of an abandoned building that I know is my cousin's, and there should be no one in there, and he looked like Al-Qaeda. And that is not even intelligence, and that the guy looked bad. And yet I had to make the call, do we send in the troops? Should that commander send in his guys? Or is it a setup? And the building's booby-trapped, and as soon as they walk in, they're going to get blown up, which was happening at that time in Iraq. And I had just had that, I had to stop and pray and say, please, Lord, help me make the right decision. Turns out it was good intelligence. He was an Al-Qaeda bad guy. It was being used as a safe house. And when our U.S. military colleagues went in to the safe house, they found 6 Iraqis that were half alive, had been tortured so badly they were near death. And then a room full of villagers whom they had already killed because they didn't agree with or support Al-Qaeda. So that was a real lesson that day for me. It's a hard call to make.
These aren't clean stories when we talk about persecution. And you had a line in your book when you were talking about this intel from this Mahmoud, and you said there were photographs, and you said you made yourself look at the pictures of those villagers, their corpses, because you said you needed to understand what we were fighting for. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, we live very antiseptic lives here, very clean lives in America, and we're very far separated from a lot of the difficulties in the rest of the world. So if I'm going to be a counterterrorism officer, I really need to understand what it is we're fighting for and fighting against. And so as painful as it was to look at those pictures of corpses of dead people that reminded me of Holocaust pictures I've seen, it kind of sucks the breath out of you, the oxygen out of your lungs. But yet you realize, this is why I get up every day, and even though I'm exhausted and I don't think I can get through another day in Baghdad, this is why I'm doing it. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to save lives.
Mm-hmm. I can't quote this right, and it's something, that evil thrives when good people do nothing. That's the concept here. You needed to understand what we were fighting for. Can you talk to me about evil and what you've seen of it and what it actually is?
Yeah, so I've seen plenty of evil, that's for sure, up close and personal, and I've seen it expressed in horrible ways, humans to other humans. But here's what I take away from that. People have asked me, why do you believe in God? And how do you know that God exists? And I say, well, if you think about it for one moment, have you ever seen evil? Oh, yes, without a doubt. Well, so you believe evil exists, but yet you do see there is beauty in the world. Well, of course there is. Okay, in my opinion, it just seems so clear to me that the opposite of this evil is this amazing God that's much stronger than that evil. So if I say I have seen this badness, I also can say I have experienced this amazing goodness over here on this other side. And that somehow has resonated with some other folks who've never quite been able to grasp whether there's a God or not. Somehow they go, oh, that makes sense. And it certainly does for me. I have been in some places where the darkness was very tangible. It felt almost like a knife cutting through the atmosphere. Very, very hard places to live because that darkness was so all-encompassing. And so there were so many times when, in order to get through that year or two living in that place, I really had to draw upon my relationship with God and the light and the love that I got from that relationship to endure that darkness and those difficulties.
We just finished a film. It's called Tortured for Christ, and this movie is the story of Richard Wurmbrand, and he is the founder of the Voice of the Martyrs, which is an organization that I do some work for sometimes. And we filmed this movie in Romania, and it's a story that took place post-World War II when the communists took over many countries in the Iron Curtain, but one of them being Romania, and many of the Christians and outspoken Christian leaders were imprisoned. So Richard Wurmbrand spends 14 years in prison, tortured daily, in the face of the kind of evil that you're talking about. And this evil has sometimes been called the communists. It has sometimes been called the Nazis. It might be called the jihadists. Do you see the similarity over time? When Jesus said they hated me, they're going to hate you too.
Yes. And they don't even fully understand what they do sometimes. They're just driven by this darkness. They don't get it. But I absolutely, that evil is expressed in so many different ways and fashions and forms. But at the end of the day, God's power, I do believe, triumphs, and certainly I hold on to that in those moments when you can't see justice.
You mentioned, and this is, I had edited a series called IMN 2 years ago, and one of the guys in the film was someone you mentioned in your book, goes by the name Father Douglas, and he's in the IMN curriculum, and he tells some of those same stories that you have in your book. He was an example to me, and I want to hear what you've seen, because I know you've also done work now, after leaving the CIA. You've come across Christians who have been displaced by ISIS, who have had the guns pointed at their face, have been told convert or die. And what I found in this IMN curriculum, I didn't shoot it, but they kind of dumped 60 hours of footage on my desk and I put it together. So I didn't meet these people in person in Iraq, except I poured through their interviews. And they carry this love in the face of evil, which is inexplicable to me apart from the presence of God. And I saw it so many times, Father Douglas being one of them.
Yes.
Have you seen that?
I have seen that. I've seen it. Father Douglas is a beautiful expression of that. He has been tortured for Christ numerous times and has been uprooted numerous times from the cities where he lived and worked. And but yet, even in the face of all of that, he fled to Erbil from Baghdad after being displaced, forced out by Al-Qaeda. And then here he was in Erbil when hundreds of thousands of Christians fled their ancient homes in northern Iraq with ISIS on their tails. And he was the one on the other end that received hundreds of those internal refugees. And you think, who better to help these people get through the worst time in their entire life than a man who faced Al-Qaeda and was shot and his teeth broken and his back broken by his tormentors? I mean, he wasn't speaking of healing from a place of theory. He wasn't talking about forgiving those who persecute us from a theoretical perspective, but from firsthand, which I cannot even imagine.
So interpret, you mentioned earlier, one of your actual professional training is to read people, and you read body language and you read words. Tell me, here's a man, like you said, there's a bullet in his leg from an AK-47, his church has been blown up, he's been displaced, he's had his back broken, his teeth have been smashed with a hammer. What's the body language and the attitude of that man as you would assess him as a CIA agent?
He was open and loving, and I found that to be incredible because I have seen other people tortured for Christ that were so beaten down they just couldn't get back up again. They were just a shell of themselves, and I understand what that, I don't understand it myself, but I get that. And the fact that he could allow himself to come back from that with joy and peace and some form of happiness in the face of that, I just was amazed by. And his body language was just open, and the way he expressed himself nonverbally was, being a man who welcomed you with open arms. And I mean, he did not come off to me as someone who'd been repeatedly tortured. But I know that story to be true, and certainly those bullets are still inside of him. But yeah, it's amazing. If you want to talk about an amazing story of forgiveness and healing, he is an amazing example of that.
So there's this phrase that goes, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What does that mean to you?
Ooh, it's a hard thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, really hard.
It's brutally hard. It's easy to say,
yeah.
and it's really hard to actually do it. I think what's helped me is I've actually met people who used to persecute, kind of like Paul in the Bible, and then had one of those amazing experiences with, Jesus revealing himself in the bedroom in the middle of the night to this individual, and then this person miraculously converting from Islam to Christianity, and then being able to hear from someone like that and to see they are redeemable. God wants to redeem them like he wants to redeem you and I, and seeing that it's not impossible certainly helps you in your prayer life to lift up these people and to realize, even in dark places, Jesus can show up. He doesn't even need anyone else to do it. He can do it on his own in the middle of the night with nobody around.
Well, it is hard and maybe impossible in our own strength. But what you just said, you can pray. I want to bring you back to you met a guy that you wrote about, a terrorist by the name, at least the name you used was Abu Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And you described him as a scary dude, the way he was looking at you, leering at you, and you had to walk in, all 5'4" of you, and engage that guy. And I think, anyway, why don't you tell me about it?
Yeah, that was a very interesting debriefing, and I knew that file forward and backward. I knew very well who this guy was and what he represented and what he'd done. But at the end of the day, before I walked in that room, I said, Michele, all the experiences in your life to this point have brought you to this moment. All those experiences God made possible for you to understand Arab culture, for you to study terrorists and all of these things. You're ready for this. And so I realized when I walked in that door, this guy, even though I was shaking, I was nervous, I was excited, I was scared, all those things, Michele, he is still just a human being. And you have an ability, you have, this amazing light within you, and just be confident and be strong and walk in that room and do what you got to do. And, by God's grace and really through God's wisdom, being able to figure out a way to connect with that guy, make him respect me, even as a female, and make him want to work with me was an enormous challenge, but I did it. And I just showed me how when you pray for God's wisdom, he wants to give it to you, and he wants to do super interesting things with it.
You say you're in Iraq, and you're a woman, and you can maybe explain to me what that means in Iraq. You're a Christian, and you're a CIA agent. Those wouldn't be the three most popular, I would get elected, probably campaign slogans at that time.
And I knew walking into the room, this guy is, first of all, I'm his enemy as an American. I'm doubly his enemy as a CIA intelligence officer. I'm triple his enemy because he's going to assume I'm a Christian. Whether he's right or not, he will make that assumption. And finally, I am a woman. And I really shouldn't be allowed out of the home with my face uncovered and without a male escort. And I should not be interacting with a man who's not my relative like this. And how do I get this guy to see me as intelligent and professional and willing, somebody that he should risk his life to work with? If you think about it, that's a huge leap. Because in his mind, I'm an incapable, not intelligent female. And then to be able to say, look, I'm intelligent, I can speak Arabic, I know your country, I understand where you're coming from, I get your motivations. And again, I'm intelligent and you want to work with me. And in 5 minutes or less, to be able to get him to that space was it was a high when I could make that happen. It really was.
It struck me, maybe this is not the whole story, but it struck me that what turned the corner, at least as you described it in that book, is that you learned his world. You learned his neighborhood. You knew the details of who was calling the shots in his neighborhood, of what the changing dynamics were. You didn't just go in there sort of wrapped up in yourself. You went in there wrapped up in his world. And once he heard you articulate that, I think it strikes me that changed the dynamic. Is that accurate?
That's 100% accurate. Absolutely. When I was able to walk in there and talk to him intelligently about what was going on in his village, what kind of risk he was taking as a human being, and what I admired about what he had already done in partnership with the CIA, what I admired about Iraqi culture. And when I was, as you said, focused on him and his world, it absolutely broke down the walls. Because being friendly is not enough. Being smart and expert at what you do is absolutely critical in those moments.
These things just strike me if we're listening to the podcast today. And again, we're with Michele Rigby Assad, author of Breaking Cover, her book describing her time in the CIA and her time in the Middle East, and what she has been through in these uncomfortable situations. Sometimes we'll talk more maybe some of the dangerous situations, but in this situation, she's trying to break through a cultural divide. And I think the lessons that you described in the book are important for us as Christians to do. We want to share Christ with somebody. That's our thing, but we have to know their thing. Paul walks into Athens and he studies all of their gods and says, I even found an altar to the unknown God. He goes in there learning about them. And he
knew how to
ice.
speak their language.
Right.
And he knew how to use words that resonated with them.
And he was brave. Now, there's a bravery that goes through you in every page of the book, and I think that is a common, there's fear. And you can talk about the fear, but you also, Paul stands before the Areopagus. That's the group that had told Socrates to go drink some hemlock. If they don't like you, it's off with your head. You have been in dangerous situations, and well, tell me about this one. I like this one. You're in a car by yourself, right? And you're just at a stoplight. Yes. What could be so bad about a stoplight?
Right. So that day I was by myself in my SUV driving to work, and I'm stopped at a stoplight, and a car pulls up behind my car, and a gentleman, well, not really a gentleman, a man is crossing the road in front of me, and he stops in front of my vehicle, looks through the windshield, and sees that my face is not covered. And unfortunately, gets very excited because this is a culture where you don't see women's faces. And so he started pulling out a very nasty activity in front of my car in the middle of broad daylight, which was incredibly embarrassing. And I realized, I just need to get away from this area because as he's standing there doing his thing, men are coming around from the corners, from the nooks, from the shops, and they're now coming over to find out what's eliciting this outburst in my vehicle. And I have now gone from a situation of being embarrassed to now it's turned into a security threat. Because if my car is surrounded, which I'd seen happen many times in the city, surrounded by literally hundreds of people, they would see you as a target of opportunity, and they would take you, kidnap you, and sell you to Al-Qaeda. And my husband and I had told each other, you can never get taken because they always were killed. No one ever came back from that. And so it was a situation where I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, I'm in complete danger at this moment. And if they see I'm alone in this car, that's it. I'm done. And I actually had to use my CIA paramilitary training to do what we call get off the X, which is, use your car to get off to a place of safety. And I unfortunately had to hit this man, not run him over, thankfully, just hit him twice before he'd finally move and I could get away. But that was that was not a fun moment for me at all.
you put a parenthetical in your book that you said, they really don't have enough to do. And it's funny that you mentioned that. My first trip to the Middle East was a long time ago. It was in the 80s. And I was right out of college, and I was on a photo assignment, and I was in the end of a 3-week trip in the Middle East, and then I was in Cairo, and then I was going to fly home. And the two older guys who kind of were, older guys, so I was dependent on them, they left, and they went off to Cyprus while I was going to stay in Cairo. While I was there, I was taking a trip to the Giza pyramids, and the guy stops the little car, and he's listening to the radio, and he turns around, and I didn't speak any Arabic at all, but he's like, there's shooting, and we're going back. Okay, well, there's shooting. Anyway, the city was locked down for 3 days, and I thought I'd never, you talk about the boredom of the Middle East, the boredom. But I remember driving at that time, seeing thousands of young men just sitting around doing nothing. And I thought to myself, if I was that bored, I'd join any group just for something to do.
Right.
Is it still that way?
Like a gang. Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds you of what gangs, prey on young men who don't have purpose and don't have enough to do and have no meaning and all of that. Same thing, yes.
So sometimes you were alone in a car. Sometimes you had situations where maybe people would have taken an opportunity to kidnap you. But bombs aren't nearly that personal nor specific. And you talked about, being in the green zone and working, and it sort of sounds like, you're in a different country, but you're going about your business. And then all of a sudden, they start dialing in the IEDs. They start dialing in the bombs. And tell me about that.
Yeah. So many Americans who have served in Iraq and served in Baghdad specifically understand the experience of running to the bunkers, because the Shia insurgents would shoot the rockets towards the green zone. And at one point, they got really, really good at it, which meant those indirect fire weapons, which were usually very, quote, indirect, were making their marks, and they were landing all over our compound. And so we were constantly, the alarm would go off, and it would go wonk, 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 incoming, incoming, incoming. So it repeated it 3 times, and you had 0 to 5 seconds to get into a bunker before the rockets started exploding around you. And the stress of living that way for an entire year and dealing with that multiple times a day and night, and these rockets were injuring and killing people on our compound, and it was just a incredibly, you smell it, you feel it, the earth shakes underneath your feet, things are exploding around you. The only thing you have in that moment is really your prayers, lifting them up to God and saying, please, Lord, this is not how I envisioned it ending, But it does really bring you closer to God in those moments, because you've got to trust Him.
And so all of you out there listening by the millions to the podcast today who are complaining about your job today, you've got a bad boss, there are kids being ornery in your classroom, you have a long ride to drive your truck, whatever it is, maybe we can just listen to Michele today and thank God there's not bombs going off at our workplace. Or maybe we can take something from Michele, which is the courage to go ahead and take that interview, go ahead and do that difficult thing, face that Abu Muhammad, and trust that God has you in that position for a reason, and get to know that person and break through the barriers. And she has given us some fantastic stories about how that has happened in her life. I want to ask you about this really funny story where, I guess funny in the fact that it's over and it's in the book now, but you're meeting this guy Khalid, and you're trying to talk him into cooperating, and you realize that you're being spies, and you're working with Joseph, and you both forgot to take your wedding rings off. That seems like a kind of basic 101 training thing. Is that really as dumb as it seems?
Yeah, it was. It was that dumb. Yeah, people think you're so cool. You work for CIA. You must be uber cool. And I say, if you only knew.
Well,
and so I had to include those stories. Those. I'm trying to inspire you, but I'm also trying to show you that I'm like a normal person. My husband's normal. We do silly things too. And that day in the debriefing room, as my husband and I were wearing matching wedding rings, and he whispered in my ear, because we're trying not to let this terrorist source know that we're married or we have this personal connection, take off your ring. And, I take mine off, he takes his off, we're trying to hide it, and then as we sit down to have this really critical debriefing, Joseph's ring falls out of his hand and bounces across the table, landing squarely in front of that guy who thinks Joseph's a Muslim, and by wearing a gold
wedding ring.
He's now shown him very clearly he's not. And so it was one of those silly moments where you're more like Inspector Clouseau and less like Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
I read that paragraph and said, you know what, we're all doomed. If this is a top CIA couple and they're bouncing their wedding rings in front of a guy while they're posing as Muslim, oh my goodness.
We're all humans.
Now, we're all humans. I mean, you remember the old Sting song, I Hope the Russians Love Their Children Too? I mean, I guess that dates me, and maybe you don't remember that. But
I don't.
You what? That's old.
I actually don't know that song, but that sounds good.
It's an old Sting song. I hope the Russians love their children too. You talked about a woman, I think her name might have been Amina, and she says to you, why don't Americans value their families like Arabs do? You know how odd that sounds for us over here? What does that mean? How do we learn from that?
Yeah, that really bothered me because we were, I couldn't speak to her. It was just the two of us. My level of Arabic wasn't sufficient to get into the nitty-gritty of culture on that level. And what I think she was trying to say is, you move around, you leave your families behind, you move to different states, and you send off your old people to go live in old folks' homes. And, and in her mind, she thought that meant we don't love each other and we're not close. And trying to explain to her just because my sister and I live in different states does not lessen my love for my sister and that we're very closely connected nonetheless. It's just so strange because it's just different. It's outside of what she understood. So we make these very quick judgment calls about other cultures while not fully understanding what they're really like. And we're all human beings, and she didn't get that about us, and I'm sure we often don't get that right about them.
Well, and there was a tremendous irony in this because while she's asking you why the Americans don't value their families like the Arabs do, and you're hoping that your husband is off making some real progress with her husband,
yes.
And you're trying to kill time by watching the clock tick,
yes.
he wasn't out valuing his family at all, was he?
No, in fact, so she was asking me why there was so much divorce in America, and you clearly have no value for your spouse, and what does this say about American culture? And again, I'm at a loss for words in Arabic, and meanwhile, instead of my husband being able to collect this really great intelligence from this dude, he's taken my husband down the street to a bar so he can meet with his girlfriend while I'm entertaining his wife and baby in our home, and she's telling me how poor American culture is. That was a really hard pill to swallow in that moment.
There's your glamorous CIA job for you right there.
Exactly.
Well, let me ask you one last thing, and I'm so interested because I think just as we maybe don't remember that, like you said, we're all humans, but it's easy for us in the West to forget that there's a church over there, that there are Christians throughout the Middle East. And I think we're all guilty of thinking, no, everybody in Iran is Muslim, everybody in Iraq is Muslim, everybody in Saudi, wherever. That's not the case, is it?
Right. Yes. It's so you've got a huge, significant population of Christians, the largest in the Middle East, in Egypt. And you've got millions in Lebanon, and you've got some in Syria. You've got very few left in Iraq, but even just a few years ago, it was a huge part of Iraq's population. And there are Sunnis and there are Shia, and there are those that are not considered Muslim by Sunnis and Shia, that from Yazidis and others. So there is a variation of belief and faith and culture all over the Middle East that I think that we don't tend to understand or grasp in the United States.
What's our job, or what's our role? What's our calling, I guess is the best word, in light of our brothers and sisters in the Middle East who are Christians or maybe those who are Muslim but are sincerely disillusioned and are interested?
Yes. So twofold. I mean, I think that for those that want to stay and are able to stay in their ancient homes and ancient villages, the extent to which we can support that for them, there's amazing NGOs and humanitarian agencies working to help those folks, then we should do that. And then the extent to which they say, we can't do this anymore, the persecution's too great, I just can't, the extent to which we can help them find refuge and get to safety, then we should also do that too. And, we've got Christians in places, not just the Middle East, but being a Christian is a really hard thing to do in many places in Asia and, even in Europe these days. So the extent to which we can see ourselves as truly part of a global body of Christ, the stronger we're going to be.
Well, it's Michele Rigby Assad with me on the No Shame podcast today, and what she's telling us about, she's shared some of this in her book, Breaking Cover, and she's seen this firsthand. This isn't just like a book out of theory. This is a book out of experience and a story out of experience. And maybe wrap us up, is there something that you kind of hope that God does through this book that people take away from it? What would be your number one hope?
My number one hope is that people read this book and they say, wow, Michele is just like me, and it inspires them to live a life of greater courage, because the whole bottom line of the book is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when their faith is greater than their fear. And so you can't wait for that fear to dissipate. If God opens a door and it scares you, you've got to walk through it anyhow. And so it's basically encouraging people to do the things that scare them.
Well, may it be so. And like I said before we started recording, you never know who's driving down the road, who just found a podcast with no commercials, and there's something in their life that they are having to face with a faith that is greater than their fear. Thank you so much for being with us, Michele, and spending this time on this podcast. It's really a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Michele Rigby Assad, my favorite CIA former spy. Thank you again. No Shame Podcast, and we'll come at you next time. Thank you.
Have no shame.